Miss Knauss back. I'm going to read some more of Astrotwins Project Blastoff. When we left off last time, the boys, Mark and Scott, were at their grandfather's house for the summer, and they had just met a new friend named Jenny, who they're calling Egg because she's kind of an egghead. She's interested in the same kind of space stuff that the boys are. Chapter 4. If Mom and Dad had driven up at that moment, the week would have ended on a happy note. Unfortunately, Scott and Mark's parents weren't due until the next morning, and after dinner, things went kind of to heck. Jenny's mom had left the blueberry pie, and Scott was bringing it up to the table for dessert. Later, Mark said he didn't know why he did what he did. It was just one of those irresistible ideas that come into your head. Every morning, Grandpa put the rubber band from the newspaper in a plastic dish on the windowsill by the kitchen table. The dish was overflowing with rubber bands. Mark's idea was to grab one and shoot it at his brother's head. Ow! A direct hit, yes! But Mark's satisfaction didn't last. Scott swiped at his stinging ear, the pie fell to the floor, and the plate broke, shooting glass and blueberry goo everywhere. This was bad enough, but then things got worse. Barefoot, Scott stepped on a hard piece of glass, which nearly sliced his foot. Sorry, let me reread that. Barefoot, Scott stepped on a hard piece of glass, which neatly sliced his foot. "Aye!" he squealed as red ooze joined the purple stain on his heel. Grandpa was up in a flash to examine Scott's injury. Then he ordered Mark to get the first aid kit from the bathroom and maneuvered Scott onto the sofa so he could elevate his bleeding foot. While Grandpa cleaned and bandaged the cuts, Scott squeezed his eyeballs shut and willed his tears to stay put in his eyeballs. "Is it going to get infected?" he asked. "Hard to tell with the blueberry wound," Grandpa said. "You might turn purple. You might not." Meanwhile, Mark swept up the mess, did the dinner dishes, and dried them, all without being asked. Chores done, Mark approached his brother, who was still on the sofa. "Does it hurt a lot?" "What do you think?" Scott said. "You might look good purple," Mark said, "and then people could tell us apart." "Easy for you to look on the bright side," Scott said. "Boys," the grandpa said. By this time, he had made himself comfortable in his beat-up recliner and was reading the dregs of the morning newspaper. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Mark said. "You shot a rubber band at my head," Scott reminded him. "Yeah, okay, but I didn't mean to hurt your foot," Mark said. Grandpa cleared his throat. "I can't help but notice that whenever you two are around, there's high levels of conflict." The twins couldn't really argue with that. "And a correspondingly high level of destruction." Given the state of Scott's foot, not to mention the vivid purple stain on the linoleum floor, they couldn't argue there either. "Now, do you boys think that's a good thing?" "No, sir," they said. "So the question becomes, what ought we, meaning you, do about it?" The boys mumbled variations of, "We don't know, Grandpa." Then Mark added, "Do you have any suggestions?" It just so happens that he did. "I've just been reading about the Apollo-Soyuz mission you boys are so interested in. You know, up till now, the United States and the Soviet Union have been bitter enemies. The two countries working together on this huge scientific project is a step forward for world peace." Mark tried to follow his grandfather's logic. "So you're saying that since Scott and I act like enemies sometimes, we should rendezvous in space?" "I'm saying why not work together on something constructive? You're great kids who can do anything you set your minds to. What if you built a go-kart or something?" Scott and Mark liked the idea of a project. When they were 5, they had stayed up to watch Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Back then, they both wanted to be astronauts. But when they started school, it turned out to be boring, and they didn't do that well, and their teachers didn't think they were that smart. So the dream of exploring space had faded. Now, as Grandpa spoke, it came back. Scott said, "I'd rather build a spaceship than a go-kart." Mark nodded. "Me too. And maybe that egg girl can help us. Didn't she say her teacher has some kind of secret formula?" "Shh," Scott said. "Egg girl," Grandpa repeated. "Jenny," Mark said. Grandpa looked puzzled, but didn't ask for an explanation. Instead, he said, "Suit yourselves. Go on and build a spaceship in that case." Then he looked back at his newspaper. "And if you need any help, let me know." Mark had a brainstorm. "Well, actually, Grandpa, what if you let us use your workshop?" Grandpa shifted in his chair but kept his eyes on the newspaper. "We'll see," he said. The boys grinned at each other. In Grandpa speak, that meant yes. Chapter 5. "How do you build a spaceship anyway?" Mark asked his brother. He and Scott were lying in their own beds at home on Sunday morning. They could hear their dad making pancakes in the kitchen. They knew it was their dad because Mom had worked the swing shift, 4 to midnight, and would still be sleeping. She was a police officer too, the first woman on their town's force. "It might be pretty hard," Scott said. "I think we need a whole lot of gasoline. It burns up and the fire pushes the spacecraft into space." Mark rolled his eyes. don't be an idiot. Anyone knows you don't put gasoline in a rocket ship. Okay, genius, Scott said. What do you put in it? Rocket fuel, said Mark, like what Egg's teacher invented. And how's that different from gasoline? Scott asked. Well, it's obviously way different because it just is. And I think you're right that we need a lot. What else do we need? Metal, said Scott. Where do we get metal? Mark climbed out of bed and stretched. You have a bad attitude, you know that? Scott sat up. We'll find it. Maybe Grandpa's got extra in his workshop. He's got everything else. I just think it might be a good idea to have a plan first, said Mark. In their hearts, Mark and Scott were as messy as any 11-year-old boys anywhere. But unlike Grandpa, their parents wouldn't tolerate chaos. For that reason, the twins' bedroom looked tidy, provided you didn't pay a visit to the dust bunnies under the bed or scrutinize the depths of the clothes closet. Now Mark tugged at the corner of his red comforter so it was more or less straight and punched his pillow. Scott, whose comforter was navy blue, did the same. Then they put on clean t-shirts over their pajama bottoms and went out to the kitchen to see how breakfast was coming. Sheesh, I thought you boys would never get up, Dad said by the way of greeting. You're burning daylight, you know that? Mark wrinkled his nose. Better than burning pancakes, Dad. Scott laughed. Good one. Huh. With a spatula, Dad looked under the edge of a pancake on the griddle. Nothing wrong with this one that syrup won't cure. Set the table, you two, and get out the milk. Oh, and Major Nelson's been wondering where his breakfast is, too. Major Nelson, under the kitchen table, thumped his tail. After breakfast, the boys cleaned up, and then they had the whole glorious summer day at their disposal. Usually that would mean riding bikes before it gets too hot, but to Mark's astonishment, Scott disappeared into the den and came back out with a yellow legal pad. Wait, I'm going to ask Mom for the thermometer, Mark said. You must be sick. Very funny, loser, said Scott. I'm doing just what you said, making a plan. Turns out it wasn't that dumb of an idea. To make a spaceship, we need metal. What else? Chapter 6. Mark sat down beside his brother on the living room sofa. Major Nelson trotted down from the kitchen, circled twice, and dropped to his favorite spot on the carpet. A parachute, Mark said. In case the astronauts need to bail out, Scott said. No, to slow the spaceship down when it's time to land, said Mark. And then I think we need a second one that floats it back to Earth. Back to Greenwood Lake, you mean, said Scott. That's where we're going to splash down. And we need electrical wiring for the controls and a heat shield, said Mark. Scott looked up. A what? I read it in Life magazine, Mark shrugged. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it keeps the spaceship from burning up like an overcooked pancake when it's coming back through the atmosphere. Scott wrote it down. Sounds important. Anything else? A window, said Mark, and a periscope. That way you can see all around, like out of a submarine. Oh, yeah, said Scott. It would be pretty crazy to go all that way and not see anything. A spacesuit, said Mark. A camera. Air tanks. Hoses. Scott was writing feverishly and then looked up. Switches, cables, fuses, circuit breakers. Mark nodded. Yeah, keep writing. And something else, a fire extinguisher. Scott didn't want to think about a fire extinguisher, but he wrote it down just the same. Like his brother, he was well aware of the Apollo 1 disaster in 1967, when 3 astronauts died in a fire in a capsule still on the launch pad. We need a radio, too, Scott said, to talk to Mission Control. Mission Control can be Egg's job, Mark said. But what if she wants to go into space? Be an astronaut, Scott asked. Mark shook his head. Girls can't be astronauts. Well, maybe they can, Scott said. Some people say girls can't be cops either, but look at Mom. Mark thought about that. Yeah, but NASA doesn't take girl astronauts. There's a first time for everything, Scott said. So maybe Egg will fly with us and be the first. Only no one will know because the whole thing's a secret. You bet it will be a secret, Mark said. What if our friends found out that we flew into space with a girl? It would be over for us. This made the boys laugh, but it also raised an important question. How many astronauts could their spaceship hold? And who would they be? Each twin was sure about one thing. If he was going to do all the work to build a spaceship, he was definitely going to be going up into space. Scott flexed his fingers, which were tired from so much writing, and showed the list to his brother. His handwriting was small and neat. Mark usually made fun of him for it, but now it made the list look good, a good first step for their project. In fact, the twins agreed it was such a good first step that they could take the rest of the day off. They stood up to go to the garage to get their bikes. Major Nelson stood up too and wagged his tail. Sorry, Nelson, Mark scratched the dog behind his ears, but you have to stay inside. Major Nelson and bicycles were not a good combination. For some reason, the dog seemed to think that the only good bicycle was one that had been chased, knocked down, and flattened. By the way, what kind of spaceship are we building? Scott asked as he and Mark headed out. We should keep it simple, Mark said, so maybe like a Mercury spacecraft. The Mercury program was the first to send Americans into space, starting with Alan Shepard in 1961. Scott rolled his eyes. Do you have to be such a know-it-all? I can't help it if I'm the smart one, Mark said. Just like you can't help it that you got dropped on your head. Anyway, the early Mercury flights were short. John Glenn's was just 3 orbits. A short flight would solve another problem I was thinking of. What? Scott asked. The bathroom problem. I mean, who wants to wear diapers in space? Ew, Scott grimaced. Not me. Chapter 7. When Mark and Scott were home in West Orange, their favorite pastime, even better than fighting with each other, getting in trouble, or taking stuff apart, was riding bikes. Like all their friends, they had Schwinn Stingrays, low slung on one-speeds with banana seats. The bikes, both purple, had been a birthday gift from their parents the year before. The Kellys had figured that if the bikes were identical, the twins would not be able to fight over them. Wrong. What they fought about was which bike belonged to which twin, disputes that only ended after Mark crashed his on the steep hill at the end of the block, leaving it dented, scarred, and easily identified. Now, still in their own driveway, the twins saw that their neighbor Lori was on the sidewalk riding her new birthday bike, her mom hovering over her. Lori had just turned 5, and her pink bike had training wheels. You're doing great, Lori, Mark said. Concentrating too hard to look up, Lori said, Thank you very much. Her mom smiled and waved. As the twins circled once, then took off down Greenwood Avenue toward their friend Barry Leibowitz's house. As they reached by, another neighbor, Mr. Frank, backed his big white sedan out of his driveway. Margie at 2 o'clock, Scott called to his brother. I've got him in my sights, Mark answered. Go for missile lock. I'm too close. I'm going to guns. The white car turned and came down the street behind them. He's on your tail. Brake hard and he'll fly by. Closing. Rat-a-tat-tat! Mark pumped his fist as Mr. Frank, little knowing he'd been shot down, drove by and waved. In Barry's driveway, the bikes lurched to a stop and the boys vaulted over the front porch railing. They were going to ring the bell, but Barry opened the door and said, Greetings, Earthlings. Barry was into science fiction. Hey, come out and ride with us, can you? Mark asked. I think, Barry said. My parents aren't home. Let me tell my brother. Barry's big brother, Tommy, had been an Air Force pilot in the Vietnam War. While flying on a secret mission he still couldn't talk about, he had been shot down and held prisoner for months. Now that the war was finally over, he was living with his family till he could find a job and a place of his own. Tommy was slouched on the sofa in the living room watching a Beverly Hillbillies rerun. Since leaving the Air Force, he had let his hair grow long, and he had a beard. He was wearing a tie-dye t-shirt, jeans, and sandals. One time, Mark had heard his mom say it was a good thing she knew Tommy Leibowitz was a war hero or she would have taken him for a hippie. Tommy looked up when the 3 boys came in. What's happening? Barry explained that he wanted to ride bikes. Tommy nodded. Cool. Then he looked back at the TV. Is your brother okay? Scott asked when they were all outside. Barry shrugged. I guess. Mom says he's been through a lot and we have to cut him some slack. I like his stories about flying, said Mark. We wouldn't know anything about being a pilot except for him. Does he ever talk about being in the Air Force? A POW? Scott asked. Not too much, Barry said. All I know is that he was imprisoned somewhere a place called the Hanoi Hilton. It sounds like a hotel, but I guess it wasn't so nice. Come on, Mark jumped on his bike. Where are we going today? All right, I'm going to stop right there, and I'll read the next 3 later.